Tonight we continue our study through the book of Esther, and we are in chapter 2, and we're going to look at verses 10 through 18. Just a quick review of the book. It's a fascinating book. It's about a Jewish woman who becomes a heroine in saving her country, saving her people from really extinction if this particular plan would have been carried out. And the courage that she had, that the fact that she was willing to put her own life on the line to save others. And the most fascinating thing about the entire book is that the name God is never mentioned in the book. But as we're going to see tonight, there's plenty of clues that God was up to something in this story from the very get-go. That God was working behind the scenes, God was working through people and circumstances to accomplish His plan. And that's something we can take great hope in, because today, most of our prayers, we ask God to work in people's lives. We ask God to work through circumstances, and He does, just as He did in this book. Well, it all begins with a great banquet. King Xerxes throws this massive banquet for his nobles, for the leading people throughout the Persian Empire, mainly because he's looking for support for a military campaign against Greece. His father lost a battle against the Greeks, and it was a sore spot in his life, and he wants to avenge that loss by attacking the Greeks and extending the Persian Empire, which the Persian Empire is already the largest empire that the world had seen at that time. But Xerxes wants to make it even bigger, but to do so, he's got to go up against the Greeks. So he throws this great banquet in order to get support. And things were going well. I mean, people were impressed by all the wealth of the Persian Empire. And people were probably signing up and getting on board saying, "Yes, King, we will support you. And of course, King, we would love for you to share some of that wealth with us after we win." But then it came to day 7 of the banquet, and King Xerxes had this incredibly wonderful idea of inviting the queen to come into the banquet. However, the queen had other ideas, and she said, "No, I'm not coming to your banquet." And all of a sudden, things got very embarrassing for the king. I mean, how are you going to lead a military if you can't lead your own spouse? And that became the issue for King Xerxes. It was very embarrassing. So basically, he deposes the queen. He issues an edict, and Vashti is no longer the queen. And that's how that first section ends. Then we're looking at Esther, Mordecai, and Haman, beginning in chapter 2, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 15. Now, the king's first edict was to get rid of Vashti. His second edict, which will occur at the end of chapter 3, is to get rid of all the Jewish people. And if that happens, well, that's huge. The Messiah is supposed to come through the Jewish people. And if all the Jewish people, get destroyed, exterminated, the Messiah doesn't have any people to come through. And so that becomes a huge issue. We're also introduced to the 3 main characters in the story, and that is Esther, Mordecai, and Haman. And in this particular section, each of those 3 characters has a story. The first story is about Esther. The king finally returns from battle, and he realizes, I don't have a queen. And they come up with an idea for him to get a new queen. And we're going to find out tonight that, yes, Esther becomes the new queen. Then there's Mordecai. Mordecai works for King Xerxes. He works somewhere in the palace area, the citadel of Susa, as the Bible calls it, and he has a fairly prominent position with the king, and he's going to overhear a rumor about some people wanting to assassinate the king. Well, Mordecai is going to tell Esther about the plan, and Esther is going to tell the king, and the plot is stopped, and the king's life is saved. And that happens in chapter 2, verses 19 through 23. Then there's the story of Haman in chapter 3. Haman gets promoted, and he has a really high position in the Persian Empire, and Haman loves attention. He loves the fact that people will bow down before him and almost worship him. And he just loves that. And everybody's playing along except one person, Mordecai. And now there's tension between Haman and Mordecai. And we'll talk about how that tension plays out in chapter 3. Well, we're talking about how Esther becomes the queen, which is a fascinating story of a Jewish girl who becomes the queen of the Persian Empire. We find out that Esther is incredibly beautiful, and as the story progresses, we find out she's also rather courageous as well. So Esther's going to become the queen. There's a proposal for a new queen. The king comes back from battle, 2 years out in the battlefield. So, he gets rid of his queen, Vashti. He then leaves to go fight a war for a little over 2 years. And he wins the first battle in the war and then loses every battle since then. And he comes home a defeated man. There's no parades. There's no yelling and screaming and saying, King Xerxes, you're the best. You're the greatest military leader ever. And now there's none of that because he loses. And the king comes home, and what he really seems to want is just a little compassion and comfort from his wife. Then he realizes, I don't have one of those because I deposed the queen. And so King Xerxes gets depressed, and his officials, the men around him, come up with this idea, King, you need a queen. Why don't you just pick out the most beautiful woman in the Persian Empire to be your queen? And Xerxes says, that sounds like a good idea. And so the search is made for the most beautiful women throughout the Persian Empire to come to Susa and to possibly become the next queen of Persia. And that's where Esther arrives in the story. We meet Esther and Mordecai. Mordecai and Esther are cousins, but apparently Mordecai is much older than Esther because Esther's parents die when she's young. We're not told how they die, only the fact that her parents have passed away, and Mordecai, her cousin, adopts her. So Mordecai becomes the father figure in Esther's life. And Mordecai has a position in the Persian Empire. Esther is growing up around Susa as part of the Persian Empire. And the one characteristic of Esther that stands out is her beauty. Apparently, she is a very beautiful young woman, which fits into the story that happens next. Well, tonight we're going to talk about Esther's preparation as she waits for her opportunity to become the next queen. So let me read Esther chapter 2, verses 10 through 18, and then we'll talk about this incredible story. Esther chapter 2, beginning with verse 10. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background, because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem, to the care of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Well, this is the part of the story where Esther becomes the queen. But it's interesting, as she prepares and waits, the story gets interrupted so that the author can tell us a couple of things. First, he wants us to know that Esther is hiding her Jewish identity. And she's doing it because Mordecai tells her to do it. So Esther, don't let anyone know that you're Jewish. And the second thing that the author wants us to know is the process of selection for the new queen. The Persians have this process that they're going to use for King Xerxes to choose the next queen. And it's interesting that our author doesn't criticize the process. He just tells us what it is as a matter of fact. Well, let's begin with verse 10. And we find out that Esther had not revealed her nationality. She is Jewish. And family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. What we find out is that Esther, growing up as Mordecai's child, adopted child, is very obedient to her father. And we find out so far in this story that everything Mordecai tells her to do, she does. So apparently she respects him greatly. She looks at him as a man of wisdom, and she does exactly what he tells her to do. The question becomes, why does Mordecai want Esther to hide her Jewish identity? And the writer never tells us. And if the writer doesn't tell us, then scholars get to guess. And scholars love to guess when they get an opportunity. We do know from Herodotus, and Herodotus was a Greek historian who wrote about the Persian Empire. And from Herodotus, we learn that normally the queen would come from one of the noble families of Persia. And there were 7 noble families of Persia. So normally Xerxes would choose a queen from one of those families. But in this case, he opens it up to the entire Persian Empire. But if Esther makes it known that she's Jewish, not Persian, she may never get chosen. She may have been disqualified for that reason. Another possibility is that there could have been some anti-Semitism being spread throughout the Persian Empire. How did the Gentiles deal with Jewish people at that time? We're not really told exactly how that works out. But Mordecai, also being Jewish, would understand a little bit about what it was like to be a Jewish person living among the Persians. And so he may tell Esther, I don't want you to be discriminated against. I don't want you to be picked on. I don't want you to be bullied, pushed around. So just keep the fact that you're Jewish quiet. So here's Esther. She apparently has adopted Persian customs and the Persian way of life, so much so that nobody guesses that she's Jewish. She apparently eats Jewish food. She eats Persian food, wears Persian clothing, and follows Persian customs. Nowhere are we told that Esther makes any attempt to follow Jewish law or Jewish customs. So what is Esther doing? Is she giving up her Jewishness just to fit into Persian culture? And we could contrast that with Daniel and his 3 friends. Remember when Daniel was carted off to Babylon? And Daniel refused to eat the king's meat and drink the king's wine. He said, just give me vegetables and water, because he was following Jewish kosher food laws. Esther seems to pay no attention to that. In fact, nobody knows that Esther's Jewish at all. One of the questions we have to wrestle with at the end of tonight's lesson is Esther a role model? Or is Esther someone who just kind of caved in to the Persian way of life? And that's something we'll have to wrestle with throughout this story. But we do know that it seems like Esther pays no attention to Jewish food laws, which were big for the Jewish people. The Jewish Sabbath, there's no mention of that. And there's not even a reference to the Torah, the covenant, in this entire book of Esther. So what exactly is Esther doing? Well, we find out that Mordecai, who does hold a fairly prominent position for the king, he works for the king. He's there in the citadel of Susa. He's Jewish. I wonder if he's told anyone that he's Jewish yet. Now, it does come out in chapter 3 that Mordecai is Jewish. But did he let anyone know that in advance? Perhaps he did, and he was treated horribly, and he doesn't want Esther to be treated the same. Or perhaps he too has kept his Jewish identity a secret until he can keep it a secret no more. Well, we do find out that Mordecai is a very concerned father. And because he works for the king, he's able to walk around the courtyard of the harem. He has access to that particular space. And every day he sees Esther, he talks to Esther, he finds out how she's doing. One of the questions, it's kind of a secondary question, is Mordecai a bit controlling as a parent? Is he a little bit anxious as a parent? Or is he simply a very concerned parent? And there's a fine line between all of that. Esther's obviously a young woman. One of the things I've learned from parenthood, when they're 3, 4, and 5, they really can't get into that much trouble. But when they're 20, 21, 22, there's a lot more to worry about as a parent. You don't have to worry about them at 3, 4, and 5 driving a car or who they're dating or, who they're with. You just don't have to worry about those things. But when they get into their 20s, they become a young adult, there's a lot more anxiety about those things. At least on my part there is. So, perhaps Mordecai too is just a little bit concerned, so he keeps an eye on Esther every single day. Well, beginning in verse 12, we're going to learn the process that the Persians are going to use to select the new queen. It's an interesting process, and it's a process that most people skip when they read the book. If you were to ask the average person how Esther became the queen, they would tell you that she won a beauty contest. She was the most beautiful person in the Persian Empire, and Xerxes chose her as the queen. Now, when Americans think about a beauty contest, they think about Miss America or Miss Universe. And they've watched that on television, and they've seen the different ladies, and, as you're watching it, you decide who's the most beautiful woman out there, and then you get angry at the end when the girl from your state doesn't get chosen because you thought she was more beautiful than the woman who does get chosen. But that's our understanding of a beauty contest. This was not exactly a beauty contest, although being beautiful was certainly an advantage to becoming the next queen. There's an interesting verb that's used in verses 12, 13, and 14. It's the verb to go in or to enter. You'll find that particular verb in all 3 verses. And it's the key to understanding this whole process, because that verb is loaded with sexual overtones. Then we find out in verse 14 how the process really worked. The potential queen would go to King Xerxes' residence, his private quarters, in the evening. And then she would return to the harem in the morning. So this was an overnight experience with the king. In fact, they made a movie called One Night with the King, based upon the story of Esther. So each of these virgin girls would spend one night with the king. And they weren't playing cards. This was a night of sensual lovemaking. One Night with the King is rated PG, so they probably skipped this part too, because this is not a PG part of the story. So that's how the queen's going to get selected. And we already know that whoever gets to be the queen is the one who pleases the king the most. We're already told that. So whoever spends one night with the king and pleases him the most gets to be the next queen. That's the process. But before we get to one night with the king, there's a process to get there. And it's a 12-month process of beauty treatments. You know, here's this King Xerxes, and he wants a queen. But he's got to wait at least a year, because these girls have to go through 12 months of beauty treatments in order to prepare themselves for their one night with him. So, these are very extravagant, they're very luxurious, there's creams, there's ointments, there's perfumes, and all of those are important in a very hot culture. So the creams would protect the skin against the heat of the sun. Also, it protects against body odors. You know, back in the ancient world, I don't think they'd invented deodorant yet. So back in the ancient world, you know, it's very hot. You know, body odor, you begin to smell. And then there's ointments that were for hygienic cleansing. There were perfumes like myrrh that were used. And archaeologists have uncovered something that they call a cosmetic burner. And what they would do is they would take a fragrant oil and they would heat it up on this burner. And the women would crouch down wearing like a robe, and they would allow all that fragrance to come and touch their skin and their clothing and make them smell beautiful. And apparently there were a lot of these that were used throughout the ancient world. And in Persia, their major export was oils and spices. So it's no surprise that at the royal palace, the women would have all these oils and spices. And for a solid year, they would prepare themselves to make themselves as beautiful as they possibly could for their one night with the king. We move to verse 13, and we find out that the women have no control over this process, this 12-month beauty treatment process. But when it becomes their night, their turn to go into the king, they have some flexibility. They have some opportunity to present themselves the way they would like. So anything she wanted was given to her from the harem that she could take with her to the king's palace. So she could dress in whatever clothing she wanted to. She could wear whatever jewelry she wanted to. She could fix her hair as she wanted, and she could bring any food that she wanted. So however she wanted to do this, she could express herself individually. It was up to her to do that. So it's interesting that the author never gives us an illustration or an example of what one of the women take with them. It's just whatever they wanted to take, they could take. So we're guessing at what they may have taken. Well, verse 14 explains how this works. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem. Now Haggai was in charge of these women until they spent their night with the king. Then after they spend their night with the king, there's this other eunuch called Shaashgaz, and he was in charge of the women after they spent their night with the king. According to Josephus, the Jewish historian, 400 women were chosen as potential candidates. One will become the queen. The other 399 will become concubines of the king. A concubine was like a secondary wife. She was the king's property. She could never leave the harem. If the king liked her, which the kings back then were not moral at all, they would be married to the queen, but if they liked a concubine, she could have another night with the king if the king wanted another night with her. And so, if the king never calls her, she becomes like a widow. She can't leave the harem. The king wants nothing to do with her, and she's stuck there for the rest of her life. She's the king's property. She can't leave and go marry someone else. She can't even leave and go back to her own family. She's owned by the king. And if the king happened to like some of these concubines, the king, not being moral at all, would have children by the concubines. Well, the children, especially if they were male, would be given prominent positions in the kingdom in service of their father. But they could never be an heir to the throne. The only heirs to the throne had to come from the union of the king and the queen. Because the thinking of the king is he has his legitimate children through his wife, then he has these other children through these other women. So this is the Persian Empire. Imagine yourself if you're Jewish. If you know the Ten Commandments, if you know the moral law of God and you're living among this, well, that was Esther's story. That was her experience. Well, that's how it's going to work. The next section is Esther. So now we know the process, and in verses 15 through 19, we're going to be told how Esther participates in that process. And even though the process is immoral and ungodly, somehow Esther finds favor. And Esther gets chosen as the next queen. The word favor is the Hebrew word hesed. The word hesed is often used to refer to God's loving kindness for his people. It's a word that's used in connection with the covenant. God made a covenant with Israel, and God's favor, God's loving kindness is shown to Israel through the covenant. Esther's going to find favor. She's going to find hesed, a clue perhaps that God is orchestrating the events of what's taking place. Well, in verse 15, when the turn came for Esther, and we're given some more information about her, she's the young woman that Mordecai had adopted, and she's the daughter of his uncle, Abihail. And we know that Esther's parents passed away. Mordecai has adopted her, and now it's her opportunity to go to the king. And that same phrase is used, to go to enter into the king's presence. It's her night with the king. And so she can dress any way she wants. She can wear whatever jewelry she wants. And where does she get advice from? She gets advice from Haggai, who's the king's eunuch, who liked her from the moment he saw her. In fact, according to Haggai, this contest was over a long time ago because he had already chosen Esther. And so she gets advice from him. He's the king's eunuch. He apparently knows what the king likes and doesn't like, and so his advice would be credible advice. And again, the woman who wins is the one who most pleases the king. And Haggai just might know what pleases the king the most. It's interesting that it never tells us what she takes. She gets advice from Haggai, but we're not told what advice she gave her. We're also not told how Esther feels about this whole situation. You know, in a modern story, we want to know how people feel about things. But we're never told how she feels about this. Is she on board with this, or is she not on board with this? We're never really told. In verse 16, might be a clue. It says, she was taken to King Xerxes. The word taken is a passive voice. It doesn't say that Esther joyfully went to King Xerxes. She was taken. And that word taken is the same verb that's used to describe the fact that the Israelites were taken into exile. It wasn't something they wanted, it was something that was forced upon them. But one thing is for certain, Esther has no control over this. She was chosen as one of the 400. She didn't have a voice in that either. She has to spend a night with the king, and she has no choice. And whether the king chooses her or not, well, that's up to the king, not up to her. She's kind of thrown into a situation where she has little control over what happens. And then we're given some chronological data. This happens in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, which happens to be our December-January time frame. And it happens in the 7th year of King Xerxes' reign. This was 4 years since Vashti was deposed. So the king has been without a queen for 4 years. Of course, he spent at least 2 of those years out on the battlefield. He had to wait 12 months for these women to have all these beauty treatments. Then who knows how many women he spent a night with before he finally chooses one. We don't know. But it's Esther's opportunity. The year is 479 BC, the 7th year of Xerxes' reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. There's a key word in this story. In chapter 2, verses 10 through 18, it's the word favor. Esther finds favor. And again, it's the word hesed. And it just so happens that she finds favor from Haggai in chapter 2, verse 9. She finds favor from everyone, it says, in chapter 2, verse 15. And now finally, when she goes in before the king, she finds favor in the eyes of King Xerxes. Could it be that God is showing favor to Esther so that she will become the queen? If you're a Jewish person reading this, your mind might go back to the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 39. Joseph got sold into slavery by his brothers. He didn't sign up for that. It just happened. He was taken into slavery. Didn't have a choice. Then he shows up in Egypt. He didn't want to be in Egypt. He wanted to be back home with his dad. And why not? He was his dad's favorite. But now he's like 900 miles away from dad in a foreign country. And how's that going to work? Well, Genesis 39, verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Joseph got to live in the house, didn't have to work in the field. That was favor. he actually gets placed in charge of all of Potiphar's assets. That was a great cushy job for a slave in a foreign country. So even though Joseph was in a place he didn't want to be, God was with him, and God prospered him. And then there was that incident with Potiphar's wife, when Joseph gets falsely accused. And fortunately for Joseph, he doesn't lose his head, literally. He gets thrown into prison. And what happens when he gets to prison? Genesis 39:21, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, but with that kind of background, you gotta have a clue that God's behind the story, orchestrating things the way he wants it to turn out. And here is Esther, and we don't know a whole lot about what's going on inside of her, but God is showing her favor in some rather difficult, compromising circumstances. Well, when we go back to the story, Xerxes sets a royal crown on her head, and Esther is the new queen. She's replacing Vashti. Xerxes now has a queen. But it's interesting that the author doesn't say they were married. He doesn't use the word marriage. And there might be a good reason for that. Well, they are married. The king and the queen do become husband and wife. And yes, you have a Gentile named Xerxes married to a Jewish girl named Esther. Well, about this same time, a lot of the Jewish people were finally returning to the land of Israel, to the city of Jerusalem, to rebuild their country. Many of them were now tired of living among the Gentiles. They were tired of living in exile. They wanted their country back, their homeland. So they go back to Israel to reestablish life. But there's a problem. Many of them had married Gentiles. So a lot of the Jewish men went back home to Israel, to Jerusalem, married to a Gentile woman. And Ezra, the prophet, the priest, was there. And he throws an absolute fit. In fact, he goes so far as to tell the Jewish men to divorce their Gentile women and send them on their way. And all of that was part of keeping the Jewish nation pure. Because in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 3, God had told the Jewish people not to marry Gentiles, to only marry fellow Jewish people. Now we've got the emperor of the Persian Empire married to a Jewish girl. I'm not sure if Ezra got wind of that or not. Well, King Xerxes is happy. And when you're happy in the book of Esther, what do? You give a banquet. Because there are 9 banquets in this book. And here's another banquet. In fact, it's a great banquet. It's Esther's banquet. Now, in chapter 1, Vashti throws her own banquet for the women. And she refuses to show up at Xerxes' banquet. But here in chapter 2, Xerxes throws a banquet in honor of Queen Esther. He's a happy man. In fact, he calls a holiday. And that holiday might have been that he laxed some taxes for the people. He gives gifts to the people. Xerxes is happy. Things are good again in the Persian Empire. The king has a queen. Well, I want to wrap things up tonight by having you think a little bit. There's a lot that the author doesn't tell us. He's very silent about how Esther felt about what was going on. And there's a couple possibilities in all of this. One is the fact that Esther doesn't like this one little bit. Esther may have absolutely hated her circumstances. She may have felt that being part of a harem was totally a violation of Jewish law. It was against all the moral principles that her adopted father Mordecai had taught her. And the idea of being a part of a king's harem was something she found disgusting. And lo and behold, she gets chosen. Now she's married to a Gentile king. And she's going, what could be worse? You know, all my life I just had this dream of meeting this nice Jewish boy who was very devoted to God, very devoted to Jewish law, and that I would marry him and have children by him, and we would have this wonderful family and this wonderful life together. But here I am, married to the Persian emperor, married to King Xerxes. God, why did you ever do this to me? That's one possibility. The other possibility is that Esther is having the time of her life. The idea of being part of the king's harem, she thinks that is absolutely wonderful. It fits her personality, it fits her nature, and the fact that she won. The most powerful man in the world is paying her attention, sweeping her off her feet, and making her the new queen. It doesn't get any better than this. The fact that she broke Jewish law, who cares about that? I'm having the time of my life, and things could not be any better for me. Which is true? We're never really told. There's a question that every reader of Esther has to wrestle with. Every commentator, every pastor, everyone who writes a book or makes a movie based upon this story. And here's the question. Should Esther be considered a role model? Or should Esther be viewed as a non-practicing Jewish woman to whom God shows favor in spite of her disregard for his law? Many of the resources that I read put Esther up as a role model for women. Should Esther be a role model for women? Or is Esther someone who got it all wrong, but God, out of his love, mercy, and grace, decided to show favor to her anyway? Good question. Well, some things are true. Esther has violated Jewish law in at least 5 ways. 1, she pays no attention to Jewish food laws. And you may be thinking, Jewish food laws, who cares about that anyways? Read the Gospels. They wanted Jesus' head over Jewish food laws because he was eating with the wrong people. And if you go to the book of Acts, for a Jewish person to eat non-kosher food, you're not worthy to live if you do that. Esther pays no attention to the Jewish food laws. There's no evidence, number 2, that she observes the Sabbath. And that set the Jewish people apart. None of the Gentiles knew anything about a Sabbath, but the Jewish people did. And they were to observe that every single week. But there's no evidence that Esther did. Number 3, she hides her Jewish identity. I mean, what kind of Jewish person is that? That you would hide your identity and not let people know who you are, that you have faith in the God of heaven. I mean, Daniel stood up and would not deny his Jewish faith. But Esther's hiding hers. And not only that, she doesn't use her Jewish name. She uses her Persian name, Esther, which she's named after a pagan goddess, Ishtar. Then number 4, yes, she does violate Jewish moral law when she spends one night with the king. And number 5, she marries the Gentile king. Interesting questions to ask about this story, and it's fascinating that the author just gives us the facts, He never gives us the feelings behind the facts. We're kind of left wondering. So, before we put Esther up on a pedestal as a model of virtue, we might want to think through this story just a little bit more. And before we decide to start throwing stones at Esther, perhaps we should look in the mirror. Because aren't we too people who have violated God's law, but God, out of His love, mercy, and grace, has shown us favor in Jesus Christ? Where do we land on this? Well, maybe we'll keep asking that question as we keep telling the story through further chapters. A role model or a rule breaker? Where does Esther fit in? Yeah, we could ask ourselves that same question. Where do we fit in? Are we a role model or a rule breaker? Well, I think we can conclude that all of us need the love, mercy, and grace of God. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this part of the story. It raises a lot of questions that we don't have good answers to, but it certainly makes us think. And it certainly causes us to question whether we're fitting into our own culture instead of living out what you want us to do. It certainly raises the question about whether we're a role model that we would like people to follow, or do we have our own issues where we've compromised, where we've given in. Father, I pray as we continue this story, that you'll continue to challenge us and grow us and strengthen us in our faith. And may we not take the story lightly, because we're invited into the story to ask those questions, to think through them, to wrestle with them, and to come up with conclusions for our own lives and how we're following you. And Father, again, thank you for your love, mercy, and grace. We all are so blessed because you love us. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.